was the moment after class one day in seminary, and I was standing in the kitchen at Starr King School for the Ministry. And the kitchen, like it is in a home, is the place, of course, where the most intimate conversations happen. This is, well, we're going to get to that next week. We're going to talk all about the kitchen table. But there was actually a movement. The reason that there was a kitchen at Starr King and in so many of our churches, the whole building is centered around a kitchen, was because of this movement in the 1800s, the Iowa Sisterhood, these women ministers who were spreading the good news of Unitarianism and Universalism, but were building congregations that were centered and around a church that was more like a home than a public institution. This idea that we should be gathering together at home here and having, having those kinds of conversations that you have in the kitchen. So we were in the kitchen, Keisha and I, a classmate who wanted to tell me about a dream she had just had the night before. In this dream, Keisha was holding a baby, and she wanted someone to care for this baby. She kept turning to everyone around her, is this your baby? Is this your baby? And she knew in that dream logic that it was. It was each person who she asked, this was their baby, but each person who she asked, she would turn to them and they would deny it. No, that's not my baby. No one wanted to care for this baby. And she realized in that dream logic that this baby was racism. And no one wanted to hold it. No one wanted to take care of it. No one wanted to claim it as their own. And it was a powerful moment for me. I talked to her years later, and she had no memory of this dream or this conversation. But for me, it stuck. So maybe she offered this dream to me. But I was struck because I'd always thought about racism as more of a monster than a baby. This monster that needed to be dealt with, perhaps a demon that needed to be destroyed. I first came to my own journey to figure out what my role in racism was when I was about 15 years old. And I was the facilitator for our area youth movement. I was the chair of our youth council for the area. And at a retreat, after leading what I thought was a very successful series of meetings, one of the other members of the council, a close friend of mine, came to me and said she had just been at this national gathering learning about anti-racism work and how to further our understanding of how we might all be participating in racism. She told me, Marcus, the way you're leading this meeting, it's racist and what's more, patriarchal. I can hear from some of your mutterings that you imagine how I might have felt in that moment. Oh, I'm good, right? We so want to be good. Oh, I wanted to be good, and I wanted to be pure and innocent and never have done anything wrong and never hurt anyone. The details aside of what might have made my leadership at that moment racist and patriarchal, the ways that I was using my voice too often to repeat other people's words, the learnings that I could do about my leadership. What I want to tell you about that story is that moment that I collapsed. I collapsed so fully I had to leave. I couldn't even be in the room with those people anymore. I sobbed my way for an hour around the hills in the Los Gatos home that we were gathered in for that retreat. These moments that we awaken to an old pain that is living in us and through us, and that through us is impacting others around us, these are not easy moments. To hold the awareness of one's own inherent and innate goodness, and at the same time to take accountability, responsibility for the impact we have on others, this is one of the hardest spiritual practices I know. But it got easier after that first time. I've never again, after being accused of or finding out that I had harmed someone in a way that played into dynamics of misogyny or racism or any other oppression, as a person of a great deal of privilege, never again have I collapsed for an hour in tears. I remember once in college, a friend of mine and I, we were in a class on Black feminism, and we were working on a project for it, and we were talking to our teacher and another member of the faculty at the school about who we might get involved in it, and we talked about, oh, there's that one Black woman in our class, she's so articulate. Oh, and we had no idea, I had no idea how that would land to these two Black women faculty members to call another student, a Black student, articulate. But I was lucky enough that they were there, paid by our college to help us learn. And so she said, you know, I know this isn't what you mean, Marcus, but this is how that word is heard. And I didn't collapse and cry for an hour, but I still had that reaction in my body, that constriction in my chest, that sense of how can I possibly hold my own goodness and take accountability for this harm. Schleiermacher was a theologian in the 19th century. He was part of that gestalt of German theologians who were wrestling with the Enlightenment and Christianity. How do you hold the rational Enlightenment, or enlightenment, as one of my teachers would have called it, alongside our religious heritage? And Schleiermacher wanted to find a ground of being, a ground of theology that was not biblical literalism or scientific rationalism. He wanted something else, and so he called it affect theology. And nobody knew what he was talking about, and he was dismissed for generations thereafter. But a contemporary UU theologian, Tandeka, has done work with his ideas of affect theology and said, what Schleiermacher was missing, looking for this universal, this natural ground of being, this thing that would be common to all people because it's common to the nature of reality, what he was missing was neuroscience. And that with neuroscience today, that we are coming to a naturalistic foundation that is about how human beings operate. So I'm going to make sure we're all a little bit caught up on the neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscientist. You might know that already. But I'm very interested. So I've read a lot, and I'm convinced that there's important insights for our religiosity in the field of neuroscience. So this is how Dan Siegel explains it, and this is, I'm making a very big thing small here, so I know there may be, more likely than not, a neuroscientist or two in this room. You just let me know later what I get wrong. So this is Daniel Siegel's model. He says, take your fist like this, and we're going to talk about 3 parts of the brain. The most evolved, most recent part of the brain is going to be your fingers here on the top. And that's the frontal cortex, the neocortex, the prefrontal cortex, right? This most advanced, most human part of the brain, most uniquely human. But then under that, deeper down, is the mammalian part of the brain, he would call it, or the emotional center, the limbic brain. And that's where your hippocampus, and he'd say your amygdala is about there. And that emotional limbic mammalian center of the brain, that's there to regulate emotions. It doesn't do the complex thinking that we do in our prefrontal cortex, which, by the way, we think we all know now doesn't develop fully until we're at least 25. They're saying maybe up to 30 now, right? So it doesn't do the advanced thinking. It can't do calculus. But it regulates the emotions. And in particular, this is where the attachment system lives. This is how we relate to other people as animal-to-animal members of a tribe. It's the same way that other mammals relate. It's how we know if we belong or not. This limbic system alerts us. And then down at the base, connecting down to that spinal cord, is the reptilian brain, that oldest, most ancient part of the brain, responsible, of course, for flight and fight and freeze. And now we're adding more: fawn, submit, attach or cry, all of those instinctual reactions. Now, these all, of course, are connected, right? So when we have a sense in our mammalian limbic brain that we might be at danger of not belonging to the group that we're in, that we have an investment as mammals in our own survival in belonging to, that limbic brain will set off the reptilian brain to believe that we're in survival level danger. And when that happens, we lose contact with the prefrontal cortex, right? So this is simple terms, but what Daniel Siegel says is that we flip our lid. Because these processes then are not just happening, of course, in the brain, they're happening throughout the body, but the prefrontal cortex and that thinking part of the brain, its connection to the body is mediated through these older, more instinctive parts of the brain. When trauma is unresolved in the body, whether that trauma came from a shocking situation, a traumatic event, or whether it was an inherited historical trauma or a collective trauma, it changes the way all of these parts of ourselves are able to relate to one another, right? So Resmaa Menakem is a psychotherapist and an author. He wrote a really important book called My Grandmother's Hands, tracing the history of racism as a body-to-body transmission of trauma. He called the book My Grandmother's Hands because he remembered a conversation once as a child looking at his grandmother's stubby, thick fingers and looking at his own delicate, supple fingers and asking her, "What's wrong with your hands, Grandma?" And so she told him the story of picking cotton from when she was 4 years old and what the cotton burrs do to the fingers. But he said that the trauma we inherit, so much of it is not visible like those fingers. It's happening at a more subtle and more fundamental level of our beings. And therefore, the healing that we will need in order to transform it is also going to happen at those more subtle levels. How to be present to ourselves, to our own bodies, as we allow and feel the trauma of historical wounds to arise in us. You have to read the book to get his detailed mapping of the different ways that this white body supremacy trauma plays out in different people. That's his name for it, white body supremacy, this story that we have that white bodies are superior and therefore deserving of more comfort and care. I don't think that anybody in this room believes that in your prefrontal cortex. The problem is these stories, they don't live in our prefrontal cortex alone, they live in the cellular makeup of our bodies. They live at that level that relates back to that Schleiermacher's idea of affect theology. So we'll get there. Menakem's history traces back to before people from Africa were brought to this land, looking at the ways that white bodies, powerful white bodies in Europe, before people were even talking about white bodies, used less powerful white bodies, other white bodies, to work through their trauma. The ways that people tortured and hurt one another, that then those same less powerful white bodies who were traumatized came and found other bodies, indigenous bodies and black bodies, who they could work that through their trauma on. You know the history, you know what happened here, right? But what we're learning is the subtlety of just how deep the transmissions were. They did a study on mice about this, on epigenetics. Have you heard any of the recent work on epigenetics? The one that just like, oh, that's it, got me, was mice. They took them, and the ethics of studying mice like this we'll have to set aside for another day, but they traumatized these mice by shocking them alongside having them smell cherry blossom scent. So the mice getting shocked and smelling cherry blossoms, the children of those mice and the grandchildren of those mice, when presented with cherry blossom scent, even though they were not raised by the parents who had been studied and traumatized, had neurological reactions of shock to the cherry blossom scent. When these things arise, how will we heal? Menakem offers the paradigm of clean pain and dirty pain. He says that dirty pain is when we blow our trauma through or attempt to blow our trauma through someone else, pass that trauma along. It's not effective. It provides some temporary relief of the affective state, but it doesn't actually heal the wound. Instead, what he says is that clean pain is the way to do this. Clean pain, to feel the experience of the pain fully and presently, to own it for oneself and allow it to move through. There were pictures that brought home the reality of what white bodies carry in terms of white body supremacy trauma to me. Pictures of mobs of white people at lynches in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Photographs of a picnic scene where people are happy, smiling. This is an event, an occasion to come out and enjoy, mirrored back to those medieval times when it would be a market competed upon for who could host the execution because it was a fair day. White, smiling bodies with a black lynched body all in one picture. What struck me is the sense of how deeply dissociated one would have to be present to that shocking atrocity and enjoy a family picnic. How deeply that's not normal human behavior. That's not what okay people do. That's evil. And yet, so many of us have and could participate in evil given the right circumstances. So this lens of trauma, this way of understanding it, it's not about an excuse. It's not about saying that we can excuse behavior because it arises out of trauma. It's a way of understanding it so that we can better, more effectively do the work of healing through clean pain. And what Tendeko says is that that work of healing through clean pain, that is part of the purpose of religious community. Because what we need to do is give ourselves a collective experience of ritual, of singing and speaking words together, of being embodied together, that allows us to grow our capacity to stay with ourselves in our pain. This is what Menakem wants us to try. I honestly, it's a very strange thing for me to ask you to try this, but I'm going to. He says, preachers, you should start your services by having everyone take their hand and just pat their belly like this. Because this is where your vagus nerve is. This is where the endings of your vagus nerve are down here in your belly, and that's that soul nerve, it's sometimes called, this deep nerve that's connected right up to the brainstem. And if we do this together, Menakem says, we might grow our capacity to feel safe among ourselves, to co-regulate. And then he says, not only so we're going to be tapping this vagus nerve, and you can go on YouTube and get videos of vagal toning. You can, do this all the time if you want. But you're going to hum. We're going to hum together for a moment while we tap this vagus nerve. So just try this with me for a minute. And see if you can get that humming to come not just from your throat and your nose and your mouth, but all the way down from that deeper place, from that vagal nerve ending belly. And then we have to do it a little bit longer because we have to do it long enough that it stops being just like, whoa, this is weird, and actually into, okay, what am I feeling? What's happening in my body? Take a deep breath, let it out with a sigh. When I lived in Vancouver, on the 11th day of the 11th month, there was a tremendous gathering. Everybody came. The folks with gray hair and nice jackets and the folks with ripped up pants and tattoos and piercings, they all came, all wearing their red poppies. And it was so striking to me to have this common ritual, this saying we can hold the pain and suffering of violence and atrocities of war without talking about who's right and who's wrong, or about rallying everyone behind a flag, but simply being together in relationship to where it hurts. In Buddhism, The idea is that when we sit in mindful practice, a sankhara, an old craving or aversion that's been lodged somewhere in the body, will arise. And if we can greet it without reacting, without moving from that original affective response to a reactive action towards it, it will have the space to surface, release, and heal. Whatever pain is ripening in your life, whatever your parents or your grandparents or those who came before passed down to you as your work to heal, whatever in your own life has come full circle and arisen in a moment, whatever it is that you're feeling in any moment, you have the capacity to be present to it, to hold it with love and care, release it for yourself and for our common humanity. May it be so. Amen.